The chapel doors groaned open, and Margaret stood framed in the entrance like a spectre from another time. Her eyes scanned the rows of guests with the intensity of someone searching for an escape route, or perhaps a weapon. No one noticed the slight tremor in her gloved hands, nor the way her lips moved in silent conversation with ghosts only she could see. But Emily noticed. From where she stood in the bridal suite, peering through a crack in the door, she watched her mother's arrival with a sinking feeling that had been growing for weeks, like ice spreading across a winter lake. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. And whatever her mother was about to do, Emily knew with bone-deep certainty that it would change everything. The morning had begun with sunshine streaming through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in fractured rainbows. Emily had woken in her childhood bedroom, her wedding dress hanging like a promise against the closet door. Her bridesmaids had arrived early, armed with champagne and laughter, filling the house with the kind of joy that should have been infectious. But Margaret had been absent. "Has anyone seen my mother?" Emily had asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice as her best friend, Claire, fastened the last pearl button along her spine. The women exchanged glances. Margaret had been missing since dawn, leaving only a cryptic note on the kitchen counter, "I'll be at the church. There are things that must be said." Emily's father, Richard, had found the note and immediately poured himself a scotch at 9 in the morning. That alone had told Emily everything she needed to know about how seriously he took her mother's state of mind. Now, watching Margaret stride down the center aisle with the grim determination of a general entering battle, Emily felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack. Her mother wore black, not navy, not charcoal, funeral black. The choice was so deliberately provocative that several guests gasped audibly. "Oh God," Claire whispered beside her. "Is she actually wearing mourning clothes to your wedding?" Emily couldn't respond. Her throat had closed around words that refused to form. Lucas appeared beside her, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of 2 years together. His touch was warm, steady, everything her mother's presence was not. "Hey," he murmured, concern etching lines around his eyes. "Whatever happens out there, we face it together. Okay?" She wanted to believe him. Lucas had been her anchor through every storm, including the increasingly frequent conflicts with Margaret. But as she looked at her mother now, settling into the front pew with the rigid posture of someone prepared for war, Emily wondered if even Lucas understood what they were up against, because Emily had seen this before. 3 years earlier, Emily remembered standing in almost this exact spot, wearing a different dress, preparing to introduce a different man to her family. His name had been Daniel, kind, ambitious, a rising architect with a gentle smile and plans for their future already sketched in his mind. Margaret had destroyed him in under 3 months. It started subtly, as it always did. Offhand comments about Daniel's career prospects, concerns about his family background, delivered with syrupy sweetness over Sunday dinners. Questions about his finances that masqueraded as motherly interest, but felt like interrogations. "I just want what's best for you, darling," Margaret would say, her hand cold on Emily's arm. "You deserve someone who can truly provide for you, someone better." The word better became a weapon Margaret wielded with surgical precision. Daniel wasn't cultured enough. His apartment was too small, his mother was too involved, his jokes were too crude, his silence was too sullen. There was always something, some flaw that Margaret would excavate and display like a prosecutor, presenting damning evidence. Eventually, Daniel had cracked under the pressure. "I can't do this," he'd said, his voice hollow. "Your mother will never accept me, and I can't spend my life fighting for approval I'll never receive." Emily had been devastated, but Margaret had simply smiled, touched her cheek and said, "You'll thank me someday." Before Daniel, there had been Marcus. Before Marcus, there had been Josh. Each relationship followed the same pattern. Emily would fall in love, and Margaret would systematically dismantle it, brick by careful brick, until nothing remained but rubble and regret. Emily's father had tried to intervene once after Marcus. "Margaret, you need to let her live her own life," Richard had said, his voice tight with frustration. But Margaret had turned on him with such fury that he'd never raised the subject again. "You don't understand," she'd hissed, her face pale and strained. "I'm protecting her from making a terrible mistake, from throwing her life away on someone who will—" She'd stopped herself mid-sentence, but the unfinished thought had hung in the air like smoke. Someone who will what? Emily had wondered. Hurt her? Leave her? Disappoint her? Or someone who will reveal the truth Margaret had been hiding all along? When Emily had introduced Lucas to her parents, she'd been prepared for resistance. She'd armed herself with every argument, every defense, every reason why this time would be different. Lucas was everything her previous partners hadn't been. Successful, charming, from a respected family, with impeccable credentials and a reputation that preceded him. He was a cardiovascular surgeon who volunteered at free clinics. He donated to children's hospitals. He had saved actual lives. If Margaret could find fault with Lucas, Emily had thought, then the problem clearly wasn't the men, it was her mother. For the first month, Margaret had been eerily silent. She'd smile during family dinners, ask polite questions about Lucas's work, and offer no criticism. Emily had allowed herself to hope. Then the whisper campaign had begun. It started with Margaret's friends, the bridge club ladies, the country club set, the women who had known Emily since childhood. Suddenly, everywhere Emily went, she encountered concerns. "Your mother mentioned that Lucas seems very focused on his career. Does he have time for a family? I heard he was engaged before. Do you know what happened there? Margaret says his parents are rather, what's the word, distant. That can be genetic, you know." Emily had confronted her mother after the fourth such encounter. They'd been in Margaret's pristine kitchen, sun streaming through windows that showcased a garden maintained to impossible perfection. "Why are you doing this?" Emily had demanded, her voice shaking. "Lucas is a good man. He loves me. What more do you want?" Margaret had set down her teacup with exaggerated care. "I want you to be certain. Marriage is forever, Emily. Or it should be. You can't just run away when things get difficult." The words had been strange, loaded with meaning Emily couldn't quite grasp. "I'm not running away from anything. I'm running toward something, toward a future with someone I love." "Love," Margaret had repeated, and something in her tone had made Emily's skin prickle. "Love isn't enough, darling. Trust me on that." But Emily hadn't trusted her. She'd pushed forward with the wedding plans, ignoring her mother's increasingly desperate attempts at interference. Margaret had tried to convince Richard to stop paying for the wedding. She'd suggested Emily see a therapist to work through her commitment issues Emily had never had until her mother planted them. She'd shown up unannounced at Lucas's hospital, asking colleagues intrusive questions about his character. Lucas had handled it all with remarkable grace, but Emily had seen the strain in his eyes. "Your mother really doesn't want this wedding to happen," he'd said one night, pulling her close. "But I do. I want you, Emily, forever, whatever it takes." Now, standing in the bridal suite with her mother seated in funeral black and the ceremony scheduled to begin in 15 minutes, Emily wondered if whatever it takes would be enough. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's canon, the signal that it was time. Emily's bridesmaids filed out first, their pastel dresses a stark contrast to the dread coiling in Emily's stomach. Richard appeared at her side, looking distinguished in his tuxedo but older than she remembered. When had the grey at his temples spread so far? When had the lines around his mouth deepened into permanent grooves? "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. Emily turned to him, shocked. "Dad? I mean—" He cleared his throat. Your mother has her issues, but if you're having second thoughts, any second thoughts at all, we can walk right out that back door. There's no shame in—" "I love him," Emily interrupted, her voice firm. "I love Lucas, and I'm marrying him today, no matter what Mom does or says." Richard studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we'd better not keep him waiting." The walk down the aisle was surreal. Emily was acutely aware of every eye on her, but particularly her mother's. Margaret sat rigid in the front pew, her face a mask of barely controlled emotion. Tears streaked her carefully applied makeup, but her jaw was set with determination. Lucas stood at the altar, and when his eyes met Emily's, his entire face softened with such open adoration that several guests audibly sighed. He looked perfect in his navy suit, his dark hair styled, his expression radiating the kind of joy that should have made this moment purely beautiful. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of impending disaster. The efficient Reverend Morrison had known Emily's family for decades. He smiled warmly as Richard placed Emily's hand in Lucas's and stepped back. The traditional words began: "Beloved gathered, joyful occasion, sacred union." Emily tried to focus, to be present in this moment she'd dreamed about since meeting Lucas. His hands were warm around hers. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her skin. This was right. This was good. "If anyone has reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," Reverend Morrison intoned, "speak now or forever hold your peace." It was meant to be rhetorical, a formality. No one ever actually— "Stop!" The word echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. Margaret was on her feet, one hand extended toward the altar, as if she could physically halt the proceedings through sheer will. Her face was flushed, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with something that looked almost like terror. "She cannot marry him!" Margaret's voice cracked on the last word. I will not let this happen." The chapel erupted in shocked murmurs. Guests twisted in their seats, looking between Margaret and the wedding party with undisguised fascination. Someone's phone camera flash went off. Emily felt Lucas's hands tighten around hers. "Emily," he said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "It's okay. We knew she might." "No," Emily said, pulling away from him. She turned to face her mother, rage and humiliation warring in her chest. "What are you doing?" Margaret stumbled forward, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to reach the altar. Richard tried to grab her arm, but she wrenched away from him with surprising strength. "I found something," Margaret gasped, pointing an accusing finger at Lucas. "About him, about his past." "Emily, you don't know. You can't possibly know." "Know what?" Lucas's voice was cold now, his professional composure cracking to reveal the anger beneath. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Margaret?" "You had a sealed record." Margaret's words tumbled out in a rush. "In college, an incident with a girl. It was sealed, buried, but I found it. I hired an investigator, and I found it." The chapel went deathly silent. Emily felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. A sealed record? Lucas had never mentioned— "That's a lie," Lucas said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hushed space. "I don't have any sealed records. I've never been arrested, never been charged with anything. That's complete fiction." "Is it?" Margaret demanded, pulling a folded paper from somewhere in her black dress. "Then explain this." She thrust the document toward Emily, her hand shaking. Emily took it, her mind reeling, and began to read. It took approximately 15 seconds for her to realize the truth. "This isn't Lucas," she said slowly, looking up at her mother. "This is a Lucas Morgan from Ohio. Lucas's last name is Morganton. This isn't even the same person." Margaret blinked, seeming to see the paper for the first time. Color drained from her face. "But the investigator said, your investigator made a mistake, or you paid him to tell you what you wanted to hear." Emily's voice was shaking now, but not with fear, with fury. "You did this! You deliberately tried to sabotage my wedding with false accusations because you can't stand to see me happy." "That's not... I wasn't..." Margaret seemed to collapse in on herself, her shoulders hunching. "Emily, please, you don't understand. I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" Emily's scream surprised even her. Years of repressed anger came pouring out in those two words. "From love? From happiness? From having a life of my own? What are you so terrified of, Mom? Why can't you let me go?" Margaret's face crumpled. She pressed both hands to her mouth, and Emily realized with shock that her mother was genuinely crying. Not the delicate tears she'd seen before, but great racking sobs that shook her entire frame. "Because," Margaret choked out, "I know what it's like to make the wrong choice. I know what it's like to marry the wrong person and destroy everything. And I can't watch you make the same mistake I did." The confession hung in the air, heavy with implications. Richard, who had been standing frozen near the front pew, went very still. "What did you just say?" Margaret seemed to realize all at once that she'd said too much. She looked at Richard with an expression of pure panic, then back at Emily, then at the 100 guests watching this family disintegrate in real time. "I think," Reverend Morrison said gently, "perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere private." "No." Richard's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. He walked slowly toward Margaret, his face unreadable. "No, I think everyone here deserves to hear this. After all, Margaret, you've made it a public spectacle. What did you mean, marrying the wrong person?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller than Emily had ever seen her. For the first time in Emily's life, her formidable mother looked fragile, breakable. "I didn't want to marry you," Margaret whispered. The words, though quiet, might as well have been shouted. Several guests gasped. Emily felt Lucas move closer behind her, his presence a steadying force. Richard's face went carefully blank. "I see." "No, you don't." Margaret's voice gained strength, though it remained threaded with anguish. "Richard, when we met, I was already in love with someone else. James, we were together for 2 years. We were going to run away together, start a new life, but then..." She stopped, pressing her fingers to her temples as if the memories physically hurt. "Then what?" Emily prompted, her own anger temporarily forgotten in the face of her mother's obvious pain. "Then I got pregnant." The chapel erupted in murmurs again, louder this time. Emily heard someone say, "Oh my God," and another voice mutter, "This is better than reality TV." But Emily couldn't process the audience. She was too focused on her mother's face and on the terrible implication of what she'd just said. "Pregnant," Richard repeated flatly. "With his child?" "Yes." Margaret looked at him, then at Emily, and her face was a portrait of anguish. "James wanted to keep the baby. He wanted us to leave together, to start our life. But my parents, your grandparents, Emily, they found out. They were horrified, scandalized. We were from a good family. Good families didn't have children out of wedlock. They didn't run off with men who had no prospects, no money, no connections." Emily's mind was racing, trying to piece together a timeline, trying to understand. "So they made me end it with James. They arranged for me to marry someone appropriate instead, someone who could erase the scandal, someone who would claim the child as his own." Margaret's eyes found Richard's. "You, Richard. They chose you. And like a dutiful daughter, I obeyed." Richard staggered slightly, grabbing the edge of a pew for support. His face had gone grey. "You're saying all this time you're not Emily's biological father," Margaret finished, the words falling like stones into deep water. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I've carried this secret for 30 years, and it's been poison. It's been killing me. Every time Emily fell in love, all I could see was myself at her age, making the choice that ruined my life. I couldn't let her marry for love because I knew How much it would hurt when that love wasn't enough. The silence that followed was absolute. Emily couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything except a strange, detached numbness. Everything she'd believed about her family, her history, her identity, all of it was crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. Lucas's arm came around her waist, holding her up when her legs threatened to give out. Then Richard moved. He walked past Margaret without looking at her, climbed the 2 steps to the altar, and took Emily's free hand in both of his. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Emily Catherine Walsh," he said, using her full name the way he had when she was a child. "I have been your father since the moment I first held you in the hospital. I fed you your first bottle. I walked you to your first day of school. I taught you to ride a bike, to drive a car, to change a tire. I sat through every school play, every dance recital, every soccer game. I held you when your first boyfriend broke your heart. I paid for your college education. I walked you down this aisle today." Tears were streaming down Emily's face now, hot and fast. "Biology," Richard continued, his voice rough with emotion, "is just genetics. It's just DNA. But family is who shows up. Family is who stays. And I chose you, Emily. I chose you every single day for 30 years, and I will keep choosing you for every day I have left. You are my daughter. You will always be my daughter." Emily broke then, throwing her arms around her father, and sobbing into his shoulder. She felt him shake as he held her, both of them crying together, while a chapel full of witnesses looked on. "I love you, Dad," Emily managed to choke out. "I love you so much." "I love you too, sweetheart, more than anything in this world." Udud. When they finally pulled apart, Emily became aware that the entire congregation was in tears. Claire was openly weeping into her bouquet. Even Reverend Morrison was dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. And Margaret had sunk to her knees in the aisle, her face buried in her hands, her black dress pooling around her like an oil spill. Emily walked over to her mother slowly. She should have been angry. Part of her was angry. But looking at Margaret now, she saw something she'd never noticed before, the weight of decades of guilt, of secrets kept and truths buried, of love sacrificed to propriety and fear. "Mom," Emily said softly, crouching down beside her. "Look at me." Margaret raised her head. Her makeup was destroyed, her eyes swollen and red. She looked older than Emily had ever seen her, and somehow younger too. Vulnerable in a way she'd never allowed herself to be. "I'm not you," Emily said. "My story doesn't have to be your story. I'm not making your choices or living your regrets. I'm making my own path, and yes, maybe I'll make mistakes, but they'll be my mistakes to make. You can't protect me from life, Mom. You can't protect me from the possibility of pain. All you can do is trust that you raised me well enough to handle it." "I did make your choices for you," Margaret whispered. "All those men I drove away. I thought I was saving you, but I was just trying to save myself, to rewrite my own story through yours." "I know." Emily took her mother's hands, cold and trembling. "But you don't have to do that anymore. You can let go. You can let me live. What if you get hurt? Then I get hurt. And I survive. And I learn." Emily squeezed her mother's hands. "That's what life is, Mom. It's risk. It's uncertainty. It's choosing to love someone even though you might lose them. Dad understood that. He loved me. He chose to be my father, even though I wasn't biologically his." Margaret's face crumpled again. "He's a better person than I am." "Maybe. But you can be better too. Starting today. Starting now." Margaret stared at her daughter for a long moment, seeming to really see her for the first time. Then she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out something small and gold that caught the light streaming through the stained glass. "I have a confession to make," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. I took these this morning, before anyone arrived at the church. I thought if the rings were missing, we'd have to postpone. Give you time to reconsider." She opened her palm to reveal Emily's wedding ring and Lucas's band, nestled together like sleeping birds. Fresh anger sparked in Emily's chest, but before she could speak, Margaret continued, "But I was wrong about everything. About you, about Lucas, about what it means to love someone." Margaret stood on shaky legs, then walked over to where Lucas stood, watching the entire scene unfold with remarkable composure. "I've been horrible to you. I've tried to sabotage this wedding in every way I could think of. I've spread rumors, made accusations, and tried to poison my daughter against you. And I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." She held out the rings to him. "Lucas, I've watched how you've handled my attacks. You've never retaliated, never spoken ill of me to Emily, never given her an ultimatum. You've simply loved her steadily and waited for her to make her own choice. That takes a stronger person than I am." Lucas accepted the rings, his expression softening slightly. "Margaret, I know this hasn't been easy for you. I can't imagine carrying that kind of secret for so long. But Emily is right. She's not you. And I'm not trying to erase her past or change who she is. I'm just trying to build a future with her." Margaret nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. Then she turned to address the entire chapel, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I owe all of you an apology as well. You came here to witness a celebration, and instead you've been subjected to my breakdown. But I want you all to know something." She looked at Emily and Lucas, standing together at the altar. "If there's a love worth fighting for, a love worth believing in even when you're terrified, even when every instinct tells you to run, it's this one. It's theirs." She walked back to Emily and pulled her into a fierce hug, the kind she hadn't given her daughter since Emily was a small child. "Marry him," Margaret whispered into Emily's hair. "Be happy, and forgive me someday if you can." "I forgive you now," Emily whispered back, surprising herself with the truth of it. "But Mom, you need to forgive yourself too. What happened with James, with Dad, with me? None of that means your life has been a waste. You're allowed to let go of that guilt. You're allowed to start over." Margaret pulled back, searching Emily's face as if looking for signs of deception. Finding none, she offered a watery smile. "You're wiser than I ever gave you credit for." "Well, I had to learn from someone," Emily said, managing a small smile of her own. "Even if the lessons weren't always the ones you meant to teach." Reverend Morrison cleared his throat gently. "I think," he said with a kind smile, "we have a wedding to finish, if everyone is ready." Emily looked at Lucas, really looked at him, and saw everything she needed to see in his eyes. Love, yes, but also patience, understanding, and a quiet strength that had weathered her mother's attacks without breaking. "I'm ready," she said. "So am I," Lucas replied, sliding her engagement ring back onto her finger where it belonged. They returned to their positions at the altar. Richard reclaimed his seat in the front pew, next to Margaret, who sat very still, but no longer radiated that desperate, destructive energy. Claire and the other bridesmaids composed themselves, fixing their makeup and straightening their dresses. And the wedding began again. This time, when Reverend Morrison asked if anyone objected, the silence was peaceful rather than tense. He smiled and continued with the ceremony. The vows were traditional, but they hit differently now. When Lucas promised for better or worse, Emily heard him acknowledging that they'd already survived worse, that they'd chosen each other despite every obstacle. When she promised in sickness and in health, she was promising to be there for him, the way her father had been there for her, completely, unquestionably, regardless of what secrets or struggles might surface. "I do," Lucas said, his voice clear and certain. "I do," Emily echoed, meaning it more than she'd ever meant anything. "Then by the power vested in me," Reverend Morrison announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Lucas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was soft and sweet and perfect, and when they turned to face their guests as a married couple, the applause was thunderous. People were laughing and crying simultaneously, caught up in the emotional roller coaster they'd all experienced together. At the reception, Margaret approached them nervously, as if unsure of her welcome. Emily, still riding the high of getting married despite everything, surprised them both by pulling her mother into a hug. "Thank you," Emily said into Margaret's shoulder. Margaret pulled back, confused. "For what? For almost ruining your wedding? For caring enough to be terrified of losing me? For carrying that secret for so long because you thought you were protecting me? For finally being honest, even though it was the hardest thing you've ever done?" Emily took her mother's hands. "And for giving me my dad. Even if it wasn't the way you planned, even if it started from a place of obligation, you gave me the best father I could have asked for." Margaret looked over at Richard, who was chatting with Lucas's parents, looking more relaxed than he had in years. "I didn't I? Despite everything, I got that part right." "You got more than that right," Emily said. "You raised me to be strong, to stand up for what I believe in, to fight for what I want. You just forgot that sometimes what I want isn't what you choose for me, and that's okay." Margaret nodded slowly. "I have a lot to work on. Maybe I should, I don't know, see someone, talk to someone about all of this." "I think that's a really good idea," Emily said gently. "And Emily?" Margaret's voice was small. "James, your biological father, he died 5 years ago. Car accident. But he had a family, 2 sons. Your half-brothers. They live in Oregon. If you ever wanted to reach out to them..." Emily absorbed this information, feeling oddly calm about it. "Maybe someday. Right now I have the family I need. But thank you for telling me." As the reception wore on, Emily found herself watching her father dance with Lucas's mother, both of them laughing at some shared joke. She saw her new husband charming her aunts and cousins, his natural warmth melting even the most skeptical relatives. She saw her mother standing at the edge of the dance floor, not quite ready to join in, but no longer trying to stop it either. And she realized something. Her mother's confession, as devastating as it had also been a gift. It had freed them all. Margaret from her decades of secrets and guilt, Richard from a marriage built on deception, and Emily from trying to win approval from someone too broken by their own choices to give it freely. Lucas found her watching from the head table and extended his hand. "Dance with me, Mrs. Morganton?" She let him pull her onto the dance floor, melting into his arms as a slow song began to play. "That was quite a wedding," she murmured into his shoulder. "It was perfect," he replied, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Perfect? My mother tried to stop it with false accusations, revealed a 30-year-old secret, and told my father he wasn't my biological father in front of 100 people. Exactly. It was messy and real and honest, just like life is, just like we are." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes serious. "Emily, I meant what I said in my vows, for better or worse. Today was definitely worse by most standards, but we got through it. Together. That's what matters." She kissed him then, soft and slow, while around them guests applauded and someone's uncle whooped encouragingly. When they pulled apart, Emily saw her mother watching from across the room. For the first time in months, maybe years, Margaret was smiling. Not the brittle, controlled smile she usually wore, but something genuine and soft and almost hopeful. Emily raised her glass in a silent toast. Margaret raised hers in return. And Emily understood that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, for her and Lucas, yes, but also for her mother. Margaret had lived her entire adult life trapped in the past, imprisoned by choices she'd made at 19 and secrets she'd kept for 3 decades. Now, finally, she was free. They were all free. Later that night, as Emily and Lucas prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Richard pulled her aside one last time. "I meant what I said," he told her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You're my daughter. Nothing that came out today changes that. Nothing ever will. I know, Dad, I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. Now go, enjoy your honeymoon. And Emily?" He smiled, a little sad but mostly proud. "Don't let anyone, not even your mother, not even me, make you doubt what you have with Lucas. You chose well. You chose with wisdom and courage. And I'm proud of you." Emily hugged him fiercely, then climbed into the decorated car where Lucas waited. As they drove away from the reception, trailing tin cans and covered in flower petals, she looked back at the venue one last time. Her mother stood in the doorway, illuminated by golden light, one hand raised in farewell. And for the first time in Emily's memory, Margaret looked peaceful. "Ready for forever?" Lucas asked, threading his fingers through hers. Emily turned to face the road ahead, leaving the complicated, messy, beautiful past behind them. "I've never been more ready for anything," she said, and she meant it. If you made it this far, don't forget to leave your comment, your like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories. Thanks for watching and see you soon.